Hello, educators. Thanks so much for stopping by to listen. And thanks so much also for coming to the Emergency Home Learning and More Summit. I'm really excited to be here talking with you today. Let's go ahead and dive in. So I am Jessica Catoggio. I'm the Director of Professional Learning for World Leadership School. And this is part of our Survive to Thrive series. This session today will be all about project-based learning. It will be a bit of a sprint as project-based learning. We could spend a week talking about it and learning how to implement it with our students, but we don't have a week. We have just about 30 minutes. So we're going to go quickly. I hope that you'll be able to come back and replay this session should you have any questions, or please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is here on the screen, jessica@worldleadershipschool.com. If you aren't familiar with us, the mission of World Leadership School is to partner with K-12 schools to reimagine learning and create next generation leaders. We do that in two ways. One way is by bringing students out into the world through our student travel programs. And the other way is through our educator development program, in which we coach teachers to bring purpose to learning. Most, if not all, of our work is based in project-based learning. And so I'm really looking forward to helping you be exposed to project-based learning today. And usually once people get a taste, they come back for more. So why project-based learning is a question that I've been asked about 1,000,000 times over the years. And so I'd like to talk about why project-based learning is beneficial for educators and why project-based learning is beneficial for students. So first, let's talk about educators. And this is educators that are teaching in a in-person classroom, a remote classroom. This is educators that are teaching at home. This is anyone that is leading children through learning. People leading children through learning often struggle to keep energy and passion, and teachers of project-based learning report that that project-based learning brings the energy and passion back into their teaching. They also report that they are able to really get at the content and skills that they need to cover. But because they're doing it in a project-based way, it doesn't feel boring or it doesn't feel unapproachable. The other side of that, students of project-based learning report engagement that is just through the roof. They report that they love learning, that they feel purposeful in approaching their learning, and they have test scores that reflect deeper learning than those that are not approaching the same content using project-based learning. So the why is because engagement is higher both for educators and for students, and learning is deeper for students. And really, that is our goal. We're really looking to create students that are not only full of content, but also passionate about the content that we are teaching them. So probably the best thing to do to start here is to talk about what project-based learning is not, which we're going to watch a funny video here in a second, and then sort of talk about what it is. So let's dive into this very short video here, which will help us see what project-based learning is not.
Honey, what are you doing? We gotta go?
It's Dressed Like a President Day. I'm supposed to be Martin Van Buren.
Who?
Martin Van Buren.
Google. Martin Van Buren.
I love that little Google ad, and I think it does a better job than I could in just 30 seconds showing us what project-based learning is not. Project-based learning is not a Googleable question, and it is not something that is done by parents, although that mom did a rock star job creating Martin Van Buren in no time at all. That is what project-based learning is not. Let's look at an example of what project-based learning is. And we won't watch this whole video just because of our time today, but we'll watch enough so that you can kind of get a sense of or a point of comparison with that Martin Van Buren video.
So how can we improve it so that it's clear that there's more than one thing?
You can just go to the tab that says that category.
And then have some tabs for what makes an ecosystem healthy.
Awesome ideas.
Because our students solve real-world problems, they see themselves as important, thoughtful people who are able to grapple with really tough problems and make decisions that have meaning.
Our school is a preschool through 8th grade public charter school in Washington. Our mission is really to help all students develop a lifelong love of learning.
So keep cutting.
Problem-based learning is at the heart of what we do. We think that learning is really important, but it's for a purpose. And that purpose for our kids is to solve some kind of problem that's important to them and to their lives.
What was the problem we're trying to solve? People think that spiders are disgusting and gross.
Yeah. What are the stories that we read about spiders? How are the spiders portrayed? Jonas?
In a horrible way. People think that spiders are like scary or dangerous, and actually they're not.
Right. We've been working on our spider stories for quite a while because they are the way that we're solving our problem. Why write stories?
It changed people's minds.
And what else can it change?
Their hearts.
Their hearts. Every student studied their own spider. They did research on all of the attributes of that spider. Then they had to take those facts and create a story around them.
The spider I've been researching is the bald-faced sack spider. My story is about this little spider trying to find a home and all the problems it gets through to find the perfect place to live.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop that video here. I think you can get a sense just in the 2 minutes of watching what's going on in this school and in this classroom. This is at a charter school in Washington, D.C. You can really get a sense of mom making the Martin Van Buren costume, right? Because the daughter told her that it was dressed like a President Day, and the lack of learning that's happening in that setting versus what's happening in this setting here, where students are solving a problem, they are asking questions, and they are using what they are learning, in this case, to write these stories. So when we're talking about the difference between projects, which is what I grew up doing in school, versus project-based learning, which is what how I enjoy approaching teaching. Projects are often done and sort of handed in to the teacher, right? Whereas in project-based learning, they are published and sort of presented in an authentic way. In projects, the audience is usually just right there in the school or right there in the home, whereas in project-based learning, the audience is the real world. So students are publishing their work or presenting their solutions to the world. With projects, often there is a pre-planned and very clear, sort of closed in the box way that the project will turn out. And on the very opposite side of that, project-based learning happens organically. It's driven by student inquiry, and it is open-ended. And that's one thing that often causes educators pause. If they are not used to teaching in a project-based learning manner, they're used to knowing what the students are going to turn in. So educators that are approaching teaching and learning in this way do need to be able to step back and just relinquish a little bit of that control, not knowing exactly what the students might do or what interests they might pursue. So we're going to talk a little bit about the elements of project-based learning, and that's going to kind of thread through our time together today. As I said, I am going to go quickly because we could spend a lot of time on this, but I think if you think about this slide and also think about that non-example of Martin Van Buren, you'll have kind of start to get a good sense of what we're talking about here in terms of the elements of project-based learning. So in project-based learning, it's more than just something that is produced. The process in PBL is just as important as that end product. And the end product is often, it looks like it was child developed, okay? It's not as perfect as, let's say, the pyramid I had to turn in 6th grade that my dad did for me. There was no learning happening for me in that. It looked nice, but the learning was not there. Most of the project work, we say here, happens in the classroom. Really, that is to say the project work is happening and being done by the student. So it's not mom making that Martin Van Buren costume, but it's the student asking the questions and developing whatever that end product will be. And they're doing that throughout the process of the learning. So it's not that they're going to do all of the learning and then do a project, but those two things are kind of overlaid on top of each other so that the students are, so that what they are producing is being driven by what they are learning. At World Leadership School, we use these two tools to help us plan our projects. And both of these will be shared in the resource library. So you are welcome to print out the PDF and use this for your own purposes. So here on the left is our elements checklist. And this is where any of us that sit down to plan a project or the teachers that we work with, this is always where we start. We're going to go through each of these elements here today, but we're going to do it using our wheel of pedagogy here on the right-hand side. If you look closely, you'll notice that the elements on the checklist on the left-hand side match the wheel of pedagogy here on the right-hand side. So that will become a very familiar image to us. Before we get to that though, I think it's important to know that although there are many elements to project-based learning, like we just looked at in that previous slide, most or all of those elements really are just good teaching. And you'll hear me say that a couple times today, that these are things that make for good teaching. So don't think that there's any PBL police out there that are going to come and say, oh, well, you did this PBL, but you were missing this element. It is okay, because it's just moving in the direction of good teaching to engage your students and to keep you as the educator engaged as well. So when you're developing a project, we kind of like to think that there are 3 things that you can do. You can adopt a project by looking out on the web, picking a topic. Let's say you're going to be teaching about coral reefs. If you go out there and search coral reef PBL unit, you're going to find lots and lots, I imagine, of resources out there, projects that have already been created. They're put out there for you to adopt them, okay? So that is one way to implement project-based learning. I think that's a great place to start. You might do that same thing, and you might find a barrier reef lesson or unit, and you might say, I like this, but I'm going to adapt it for my own purposes because we are more focused on fish than coral. So adapting something that's already existing is also a great way to get started. And then finally, when you're ready, an exciting thing to do is to use our template and some of the planning models that we'll look at today to create your own. Looking at real world problems or issues that exist in your community are really great places to start when thinking of ideas for a project. So you can adopt a project, you can adapt, or if you're brave, go ahead and create your own. When we do think about types of projects, these are kind of the things that we think about. You can have students solving a real world problem. That is oftentimes the most authentic way to get students engaged. Conducting an investigation, always fun. Thinking science experiments. Taking a position on an issue. And I like to sort of connect that one to the idea of solving a real world problem. What can we look for in the world, and then how can we take a position on that? Exploring an abstract question. Sometimes it's fun if you have a big thinker. And then finally, meeting a design challenge. If you have a very kinesthetic learner who likes to touch and do and build, then that might be the place for you to get started. So as we go through our time today, we're going to kind of go around this wheel and talk about each of the planning elements. I do encourage you to come back and replay as you get ready to actually plan yourself, and that will kind of remind you of some of the points that we'll make here. So the first 3 points on the wheel of pedagogy that we're going to look at all have to do with deciding what will be the focus of your project-based learning unit. What piece of curriculum or what topic of interest will you use as your focus? So we think about these first 2 here on the top, rigorous content and community engagement, as a really good place to start with planning a unit. What is it, content-wise, that you want the student to know? What will they be assessed on? What is the actual content? Is it about the fish in coral reefs, or is it something related to the election or forest fires? What is the content at the heart of your unit? And as sort of part of that, how can you connect that learning to your community? So even if I don't live near a barrier reef, are there fish that need to be healthy somewhere in a waterway near me? And what lessons can I take from my fish learning about the reef, and how can I connect that to my community? That really adds authenticity, especially for younger children. And as part of this as well, we like to think about competency-based skills. These are the skills that are aside from, but still attached to, the content skills, and they are more of the soft skills or 21st century learning skills, like empathy, communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, those things that we think of as really important to our students' development. But we like to be really intentional about listing them separately from the actual curriculum or content. So when you're thinking about your unit, think about what is the content, what are the skills, and how can I connect it to our community? Once you've got those things down, it's time to create a driving question. And driving question is really one of the key elements of a project-based learning unit. It is the question that, in fact, drives the work. So it's the question that you'll come back to as you're going through the unit, and it is what your child or student is working towards answering. Let's go back to Martin Van Buren just a second, right? And I'm looking down here in the center, not Googleable. So our driving question shouldn't be, what does Martin Van Buren look like? I can type that in Google and get my answer in no time. My driving question should be much more open-ended. It should be meaningful and authentic. It really should require some depth and some inquiry from my students. I like to think also that the driving question should be actionable, right? So we're not just seeking to understand about the fish in the coral reef, but we're seeking to take some action. Good old Bloom's taxonomy. When we're writing driving questions, we really like to keep towards the top of Bloom's, where students are analyzing, they're comparing and contrasting, they're examining, questioning. We like to have them supporting their thinking or defending a position, or designing something, producing new thinking or new original work from what they've learned within the unit. I think the most simple way to do this is to have a little formula. Question starter, so like a how can we or a how might we. The challenge, this is the actionable part, right? Design or build. So choose an actionable verb there, and then for whom. So this middle example here, how might we build a playground that is safe for young children? Very simple, but you imagine that that question could drive a lot of inquiry. In order to answer that question as a student, I need to know, well, gosh, how do you build a playground, right? What is in a playground? And this part here at the end, safe for young children. You can imagine a whole part of the inquiry getting at that. What does that mean, safe for young children? Same thing with the design a garden question. How can we design a garden that our school community will enjoy? Lots of learning to be had within both of those questions. The next stop here around our wheel of pedagogy is the inquiry spiral. And I like to kind of think of this not just as inquiry, but also engagement. So throughout your unit, what are the things that you're doing to keep the student or students engaged in the learning and sort of continuing to work towards answering that driving question? Some ideas of inquiry spiral events could be doing field work, conducting an experiment, maybe conducting an interview with an expert, going on a field trip. The field trips are safe where you live right now. Going out and kind of examining in the real world or participating in any of those things virtually. This chart that you see here on the right-hand side, I think is a great way to keep track of what students are learning as they are going through the inquiry spiral. So if you're familiar with the old KWL chart, this is kind of the updated version of that, the KWHLAQ chart. Students are still recording sort of what do you know and what do you want to know, but this takes a next step and has the students, it's more actionable, right? So that H there, how will you find out what you want to know? There's your L, what have you learned? Here's my favorite part, what action will you take, right? So now I've done this learning, now what? And still, what further questions do you have down there in the queue? So the inquiry spiral is called a spiral because imagine that you are going on a field trip, virtual or in person. There is learning that's going to happen while you're on the field trip, but then you're going to sort of come back to that learning. You're going to spiral back around to that learning as you come back and debrief, right? Or take further action. So the learning is not just happening in a straight line where you have the experience and then move on, but it's something that you're going to continue to come back to or spiral around to. The entry event or hook. This is where you really, if you have a flair for the dramatic, this is going to be your favorite part of project-based learning planning. The entry event or the hook is the way in which you are going to bring students into the unit, sort of their first experience. Let's watch this quick video here about the hook.
You may be wondering, does it really matter how I start a project? The answer is yes. This will be the first exposure your students have with the project. You want to hook their attention, get them excited, and make them want to know more. Just like a good movie trailer makes you want to go out and see the movie, a good entry event will get the kids excited about doing the project. You do not want your students to be bored or intimidated on the first day of your project. So stay away from things like project packets or requirement checklists. A good entry event will be engaging, novel, and it'll evoke an emotional response from your students. You want them to care about what it is that they're going to be doing. Some ideas for entry events are: have a mysterious letter arrive, deliver jarring news, watch a provocative video, Have a discussion about news events. Review a website. Invite a guest speaker to speak to your class. Go on a field trip. Conduct a demonstration or experiment. Read an interesting story. Or you could make your own video or cartoon. Whatever entry event you decide on will ultimately depend on your project. But remember, to spark their interest, you need to start with a bang.
Maybe not an actual bang. So I think that video did a really good job sort of telling us about the hook, but also presenting some ideas. And I love how it says that the hook should be novel. It shouldn't be your sort of humdrum every day, but should be something new that kind of makes your students perk up or say, I want to know more about that. I also like how it said that evoking some emotion is an interesting way to sort of hook the students. And here are just some examples, some that the video mentioned, but some others as well. I think a lively discussion doesn't cost you any time to plan it, and often is a really good way to hook students. And of course, virtual field trips, and there's so many resources out there related to each of these things in teaching virtually. Just have to have time to search for them. So in thinking about moving along our planning wheel, we've touched on this idea of rigorous content already, but I want to talk for a second about sort of tying that to authenticity. And oftentimes the learning that's done in a classroom or in a home setting is not necessarily authentic or related to students' lives. And so with project-based learning, we really make an effort to connect the learning to things that are authentic to students. Sometimes we think big, like this image here that I'm showing you is of the UN's sustainability goals. These are an awesome way to bring in global thinking and sort of, definitely authenticity to your learning. This is thinking big. And sometimes when we're dealing with younger children, we can think much smaller. What is authentic to us as adults is often much bigger than what's authentic to our students or to our children. And so if you think back to that first example of what PBL looks like in the classroom, that teacher was working with her students on the problem of people think spiders are scary. When we think authentic and rigorous content, that's probably not the first type of thing that comes to mind, but in fact, that is authentic. If children are reading about that in their stories or seeing spiders outside in their yards or on the street, that is authentic to them. So just kind of take a moment of pause when you're planning your unit and think, is this authentic for my student or my students? Is it authentic and connected big, globally, or is it at least authentic in their young minds and young lives? One of the things that you often hear about with project-based learning is this idea of voice and choice. And this is one of those things that I think is just good teaching. Giving students the time and the space for autonomy really helps to build their confidence as learners and as people. I think it's important that we talk about the difference between choice and voice, because you often hear those two things said almost as one word, but I like to sort of tease them out and talk about the difference. So learner choice is just as simple, excuse me, as how it sounds. It's the choice. Would you like chocolate or would you like vanilla, right? It is important, but when we're thinking about today's context and asking students to really start to communicate their own identity, that's when we get into voice. Giving learners the opportunity to communicate who they uniquely are in their learning. So if I'm going to say that I choose chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla, there's not much voice in that, right? Unless you dig deeper and maybe get the story behind why I choose chocolate instead of vanilla. So really, that voice piece is giving them choice where they can communicate their voice, but also helping connect them to audiences that with whom they can authentically share their unique voice. So it's sort of a fine line there, but I think important to tease out what is choice and what is voice, and also to hold ourselves accountable for giving our students the time and the space for both of those two things. The deliverable. So this is sort of the end game, if you think of it that way, with project-based learning. And I sort of like to think about it in two parts. So the first part is, what is the product? What are the students going to do? Are they going to create some kind of presentation that they will present or perform? Are they designing and building something? If you remember back to that driving question that we looked at, one of them was about designing a garden, right? So the process or the product deliverable for that one would be a garden design, right? So as I said, there are two parts to this. One part is, what is the student going to do? This is a great place to offer both choice and voice. And the other part of the deliverable I mentioned when we talked about voice just a moment ago, and that is this idea of an authentic audience. So if I design my new garden, as was in that driving question, it's important that I have an audience that's authentic to that product, to whom I can present. So if it's a garden for a school community, who in that community can I bring in to hear my presentation? And you can just imagine, for a student, that would really motivate them, right, to be presenting to an authentic audience. Maybe it's a local garden club. Try and think a little bit outside the box with deliverable, both the product and the audience. So in talking about project-based learning, one of the first things that often comes up as a question or a reason why people think they can't do project-based learning is this idea of assessment. Sometimes educators are afraid that if their student is just creating something throughout the PBL unit, they often will say, well, how will I know where the learning is or what they still need to learn? And I like to think about this idea of both formative and summative assessment in project-based learning. There's a quote from Robert Stakes about the chef and the soup that kind of is a perfect analogy here for assessment in project-based learning. And that is that if we are assessing formatively throughout the unit, that is like the chef tasting the soup as he or she is making it, right? At the end, when the chef serves the soup, that's like the summative assessment. So if you think about a PBL unit, there should be tasting or formative assessment going on throughout, so that the educator knows where the learning is happening. And that could be from exit tickets, it could be quizzes that are happening, pieces of writing, could just be in conversation with the student. It could also be in reflection, right? And then at the end, the summative assessment, or sort of serving the soup, is the deliverable, right? So if I have created a presentation to share with the garden club, there would be some kind of rubric as a tool to help me know how I had scored on that. And maybe it would be a rubric that the teacher was using to grade, but also maybe I would get the opportunity to grade myself. Okay, moving along here. Feedback and revision. So we often think about feedback happening just at the end, like after the soup has been served, right? But in project-based learning, building opportunity in for feedback throughout the project process is really important. And getting students, encouraging them to revise their work throughout is going to get them to a product at the end that is higher quality, but also that they take deeper pride in. In planning out a project, it's really important to make sure that the learning and the thinking is visible. And PBL Works has some great resources about project walls. If you're in a classroom, I would set up a big bulletin board in my classroom on which I would list the driving question, where we would keep our rubrics and our project calendar, vocabulary, resources, anything related to the project would go on that wall, and the wall would sort of grow throughout the period of time during the project. If you're at home or teaching children remotely, you can create that very same thing. Find a little piece of a wall in your home, or use a tech-based tool like Padlet is a great way to make a virtual project wall. So I want to watch this one little video here quickly before we go. This is by John Spencer, and it is what happens when students engage in project-based learning. I think he summarized this best. Let's watch together here.
What happens when teachers design projects that empower students with voice and choice? Students embrace a maker mindset. They define themselves as inventors and creators. They learn to take creative risks. Here they experiment and engage in iterative thinking. When this happens, they embrace a growth mindset and grow resilient. They become problem solvers and systems thinkers. They become divergent thinkers, thinking outside the box. They'll use creative constraint to find original uses for materials. Here they discover it's okay to be different. Often students embrace curiosity and wonder. They become explorers, seeking out new information and thinking critically. They grow more empathetic as they design meaningful products that they launch to the world. On an academic level, students are more engaged and the information sticks. There's often an increase in student achievement. Meanwhile, they learn key skills like project management, collaboration, and communication. True, these projects will prepare students for the creative economy, but more importantly, they empower students for a creative life. Here they see that making is magic. We know that there's a time crunch in schools. Materials can be scarce. Sometimes you're stuck with a tight curriculum map. But when you, as a teacher, empower your students with voice and choice, they become the makers who change the world.
Thank you so much for coming to listen today about project-based learning. I think we have such an exciting opportunity at this moment in education to really empower our students to build confident learners who are good communicators and collaborators. So thanks again for your time. Please reach out if you have any questions at all. Again, I'm Jessica Catoggio from World Leadership School. Thank you.